We're about to create a generic function that generates a container component to provide any component with the store object without having it deal directly with the context API. Since we're providing a store here, I'm going to call it store provider, and I'll just place it here on the same level as the article component. So we're going to remove this article container component logic and instead assume that the article container is going to be generated using the store provider function. Now this function will need to know which component it's providing for, so we'll pass the article component as its only argument here. In fact, we can simply just have this function call here as the default export here directly. Let's now create store provider. So under components, store provider. So this is going to be a simple function, store provider. This function is going to receive a certain component, and it will basically create a container component and return that. So let's do that. Let's create a new component. I'm just going to call it with store. It's a function component. So it will have props, and it will have the store object destructured out of the context argument. And this with store component is going to render our original component with the props copied out and the store passed as a property directly to the original component. And of course, since this with store component accesses the context API, we need to define the context types here, which are basically what we had before. So store is a prop types dot object. And I'm already using both React, so import React, and prop types as well. And this store provider is going to simply return with store. And I need to export this store provider function. And that's basically it. This is the simplest higher order component function. It's a function that will receive a regular React component. It will wrap it with a new component. We called this component with store. And this wrapper component will have some other logic. Like, for example, in our case, it is fetching the store out of the context API and providing the store to the original component as a prop. So at this point, we should test things out. So make sure the application is rendering, and it's still rendering. So now if you inspect the tree of the application, you'll see that the article list component actually renders the with store component. And every with store component has the store context API, and it renders an article component, and that article component only gets props. So our contained article component is now a pure presentational component, and the with store component is the container component. And it's the only one that is accessing the context API, and it's a generic one. So say, for example, I needed the store in the article list component, I can also have it wrapped with this store provider function that generates a component. It's usually a good practice to have the name of this container component related to the component that it contains. And we can easily do that using the React display name property. So we can do something like with store.displayName is, for example, we can do the original component name and container. So we'll be back to, for example, article container or any other component container. Let's test that. So I've got app, article list, and then article container. And now every time I provide the store, I'll get a container component that wraps an original component and pass down the store as a prop. Now, usually when we create higher order components, we don't use function components. We use class components because usually a higher order component is going to manage some kind of state and maybe need some component lifecycle method. So instead of function component, we can simply use a class component. So I'm going to return class extends react.component. And with a class component, we do things a bit differently. So we can use static properties for the display name and also for the context types. And after that, we need to define the render function, which is going to return the exact same thing that we have here. So component passing in the props and the store. However, in a class component, we need to do this dot props, and we need to read the context from this dot context dot store. So this would be exactly equivalent, but now using a class component instead of a function component. And now we can manage the state if we need to, and we can use lifecycle methods as well. I forgot a return statement here. Let's test and make sure things are still working. And I'm seeing the article container components wrapping article components. There is one other small fix that we need to do. The tests are now failing. And they're failing basically on this line because previously we were trying to find the article component in the shallow rendered output. And right now, a shallow rendered article list component will only have article container components. It will not see the article components at all. So we need to simply change this into article container. And at this point, I can actually remove our previous hack for the prop types on an article because the article component is not included at all in the shallow rendered output of the article list component. So if we run the tests now, this part should pass. However, we still need to update our snapshots because it's now rendering article containers and not articles. So we'll just do that.